Welcome and thank you for joining the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation virtual presentation, American Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, 1941 to 1945. I'm Laura Nelson, the President and CEO of the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation, otherwise known as the NCMF. The foundation was established 25 years ago this year to support the National Cryptologic Museum in educating the public on the importance of cryptology in defense of our nation. The foundation acquires the best artifacts for the research library and exhibits for the museum. For those who've not visited the museum located on the NSA campus in Fort Meade, Maryland, I encourage you to do so when the museum reopens once our lives return to normal, hopefully soon. Through the education and outreach programs of the foundation, like this one, we heighten public awareness of the cryptologic professions while honoring the people past, present, and future whose contributions to our national security protect and make possible our way of life. The NCMF is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we thank our members who have joined us today and continue to support us to thrive and provide programs like today's. I'll provide more information about the foundation following today's speaker. We are joined today by Dr. David Sherman, who served for 32 years at the National Security Agency, where he held a variety of managerial, analytic, and staff positions. He also held positions on the staffs of the National Security Council and National Economic Council and represented NSA to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was Dean of Academic Programs and visiting professor at the National War College from 2007 to 2010. Dave retired from the federal government senior executive service in 2017. He is also a member of the board of directors of the North American Society for Intelligence History. And Dave is a proud member of the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation, and he also advises the NC National Cryptologic Museum on its collections and exhibits. Dave will share with us the history of the first professional contacts between Britain and America in communications intelligence. He is the author of The First Americans, the 1941 U.S. code-breaking mission to Bletchley Park, published by the Center for Cryptologic History at NSA. Also of note, participating in today's webinar is John Bergman, who served in the U.S. Army during World War II. He is the last living member of the Treetop Outfit, a military intelligence organization that worked closely with their British counterparts at Bletchley Park. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks very much, Laura. Let me just share my screen because I'll be running the slides. So we're going to be talking today about a very special place and a very special relationship. We're going to be discussing the American contingent that went to Bletchley Park, several different contingents between 1941 and 1945. Bletchley, of course, was the British code-breaking center during the Second World War. It is best known, but should not be solely known, for its breaking of the supposedly unbreakable Enigma machine of the German military. And on the slide also is a group of Americans that were photographed in England. Now, before we move into Bletchley itself, we need to talk a little bit about the political and military context that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill faced in their respective nations in 1940. And it was a difficult time for both men. The British, of course, were now alone in Europe, to use Churchill's own word to describe their situation in the summer of 1940, after the fall of France. And they were subjected to the German air attack known as the Blitz on major cities in Britain. They were also threatened with invasion. By contrast, the United States, in the United States, there was a very strong isolationist sentiment. And that's captured in the cartoon there in the slide on the right, where the United States basically was choosing neutrality in the Second World War at this point. And Roosevelt was having to chart a very careful path between his desire to aid the British to the greatest extent possible and the wishes of a large portion of his countrymen who very much wanted to keep the United States out of another European war. One of the things that happens in 1940, among a number of those that took place in the summer of that year, was a British proposal that was made by the British ambassador under Churchill's authority to Roosevelt, saying we'd like to initiate an exchange of sensitive military technologies. What the British intended to put on the table and did put on the table was their developments in radar, which greatly aided the defense of Britain during the German attack in the summer of 1940 from the air. And the Americans agreed to this proposal, and the British sent over a delegation of scientists led by the man who's pictured on the screen, Henry Tizard, who demonstrated radar, including some very promising developments in how they were being able to miniaturize it so they could get it onto military systems like aircraft. And the Americans were very appreciative, very receptive, and the Tizard mission was largely thought of as a great success. One of the things that happens in the wake of that is an American general, General Strong, who's shown there on the slide, was in London for a conference with the British in early September 1940. And it's not entirely clear, but whether he did this on his own initiative or whether he was acting under some kind of instructions from Washington, but he puts on the table, let's add cryptology to the matters that we're talking about in this secret discussion that we're having between the British and the Americans. And the copy of the cable that he sends back to Washington after the British enthusiastically say, we're interested in talking about cryptology, asks the War Department, are you willing to enter into discussions, a wide range of discussions with the British about code breaking? And this provokes a very interesting reaction in military circles back in the States. The Army, and it's important to remember that the two American code breaking efforts in the US military at this time were separate in the Army and the Navy. They each had their separate organizations. And they were very small. That's another thing to bear in mind. They were starting to grow as the United States slowly built up its capabilities after the beginning of World War II, but they were still only, a maximum of several hundred people between the two at most. But the Army is more enthusiastic about General Strong's proposal than the Navy is. The Army basically says, let's put everything on the table. And the two Army officers on the left, William Friedman and Spencer Aiken, author a proposal that basically codifies that idea of an open and transparent exchange. The Navy, whose efforts were headed by Lawrence Safford on the right there, was very reluctant. Essentially, they said, well, we're willing to exchange training manuals with the British, but that's about it. And so there's this split in the United States as to whether to pursue talking to the British about cryptology. It is interesting to speculate about why the Army was so enthusiastic. And I have a theory about this that I can't prove, but it goes back to World War I, actually, when British and American, along with French codebreakers, operating in France during the latter part of World War I, did have relationships with one another. But anyways, after the war, William Friedman, who was shown on the previous slide and is with the Army, he figures out with the help of a colleague that the British actually had decrypted the Zimmerman telegram, which of course some of you probably remember as being a key moment in the series of events leading up to America's entry into World War I. And Friedman called this the most significant accomplishment in the history of code breaking. He was a bit of a student of code breaking himself. And my guess is he remembered that once we get to 1940 and the proposal comes in for a discussion with the British, he probably believed that, well, these may well be the best code breakers in the world. Of course, we want to talk to them. But the British have some reservations. British code breakers, that is, at Bletchley Park, have some reservations about talking to the Americans. Not that they're unwilling to do so, but they probably want to place some limits on this discussion. And one of the reasons for that seems to have been the publication in the early 1930s of a book called The American Black Chamber by Herbert Yardley. Herbert Yardley, of course, was essentially the head of Army code breaking during the First World War, one of the leaders of Army code breaking during the First World War. And after the Black Chamber, which was the code breaking effort during the 1920s, was dissolved at the end of that decade, he wrote a memoir that basically spilled the secrets of that organization and how it was able to break various codes during its existence. The British and others remembered this and probably were wondering, when they were a little bit reserved about talking to the Americans, can we really trust them if this is an example of how they keep secrets, or alternatively cannot keep secrets? Ultimately, the dispute between the American Army and the American Navy over whether to do this gets resolved by Roosevelt. It goes all the way up to FDR. And it's argued out before him by senior leaders from the Army and the Navy. And ultimately, he decides we're going to proceed and go ahead and have this discussion and have this exchange. Churchill approves as well, but he puts in a significant caveat that its significance will become even clearer in a few minutes. And that is, we can go ahead and have these discussions, but at the recommendation actually of Bletchley Park, he keeps the breaking of the Enigma, which was the most closely guarded secret in Britain. He says that's off limits. We cannot talk about Enigma and the so-called bomb machines that we've built to break it with the Americans. And so, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out in just a minute or two. Now, the American delegation consisted of 4 members. They were all relatively junior officers ranking between lieutenant and captain. 2 from the Army, 2 from the Navy. Friedman himself originally wanted to go, but he had a medical crisis at the end of 1940 that basically ended up with him and Walter Reed, and he wasn't able to, and he was replaced. But the 2 American officers, Army officers that went, are there on the left-hand side of the screen. Abe Sinkoff, who had been one of Friedman's first recruits in 1930 when the rebuilding of Army signals intelligence began, and Leo Rosen, who joined the organization later, but was an engineer. And it was very important, as it would turn out, that he be a part of the American group. And the Navy officers were Prescott Winter, who's there 3rd from left, and then Robert Weeks. Courier had some experience in signals intelligence and code breaking. Weeks was more of a communications security officer with the Navy, although he did apparently have some exposure to what code breaking was all about. And so these are the 4 that go. And Interestingly enough, they're taking with them the most valuable capability that American signals intelligence has at that point. And it's one of the machines, and this is on display in the museum, not the one they took, but one of the ones that was built by the Army, that the Americans built to break purple, the Japanese diplomatic code. Interestingly, it had not been broken when General Strong in London in September had proposed the exchange, and had it not been broken, the Americans would have gone over in a considerably weaker position. But it was towards the end of September 1940, and the Army proceeded to build, 4 devices called the Purple Analog, kind of a sort of a replica of the Japanese Purple machine that Tokyo's diplomats used to send encrypted cables worldwide. And so they had a grand total of 4 of these, roughly, by the end of the year when they were assembling the delegation and what to take with them. And they took one of these purple decryption machines with them to Britain. It's quite a scarce resource. This actually becomes an issue later in 1946 when the attack on Pearl Harbor is being investigated by the Congress, and it comes to light that Honolulu, Pearl Harbor itself, did not have a purple decryption machine. Even more important in that regard was the fact that the decrypts weren't being sent to commanders in Hawaii, but this gets a little blowback later on. Anyways, the Americans go over. As a matter of local interest to those of you who are still perhaps in the Maryland area, they leave from Annapolis. It's a stormy day. They're taken out in a launch to a British battleship that has just delivered a new British ambassador to Washington, and they board this ship and taken across the North Atlantic to a British military naval base in the north of Britain. Interestingly enough, some of the British on board, the British officers who weren't, they really didn't know who these Americans particularly were, and weren't really allowed to see their cargo that they were carrying with them and had brought on board. Some of the British officers apparently thought the Americans were spies. They were there to spy against Britain. And of course they were spies, but they were spies with a completely different objective. So interestingly enough, they arrive in the north of England at Scapa Flow Naval Base. They were supposed to fly down with their cargo to the London area and go to Bletchley Park. But interestingly enough, they weren't able to get their shipping crates with the equipment onto the plane. The cabin door was apparently too small. So they end up on a British cruiser that's going south. It actually gets attacked by German aircraft while en route to the London area. And the shipping crates, including the one with the purple decryption machine, are strapped to the deck up topside, and they can hear the bullets. These 4 men, the four-man American delegation, are down below, and they can hear the bullets hitting the deck. And of course, they think, oh, this is going to end right here and now because the machinery is going to be destroyed. Well, for whatever reason, the German ammunition that the strafing aircraft were using did not penetrate the shipping crates. So the mission was, in a sense, saved right then and there. Anyways, they arrive in London and they head to Bletchley Park. They're treated like royalty. They're put up at a neighboring estate that a local British lord has made available for that purpose. They have butler service and cooks and everything. They were treated very well. And they're issued permits or passes to enter Bletchley Park since it's a secret installation. And I'm very fortunate in that, or in the museum's very fortunate in that this is the pass that one of the Navy officers, Lieutenant Robert Weeks, had for his 1941 visit to Bletchley. And I've only seen a few of these surviving passes. This is one, and the Weeks family visited the museum several years ago and graciously allowed the librarian to scan it. He carried it in his wallet his entire life because he thought his visit to Bletchley was one of the most important things, if not the most important thing he had ever done. Okay, so the Americans get there. They demonstrate the purple decryption machine that's there, shown, the one in the museum on the left. And what's particularly remarkable is they give it to the British. That was the intent from the moment they sailed, that they would give the machine to the British. And the British had not been able to break the Japanese purple diplomatic code. And so this is spectacular. They are very appreciative, but it also creates a real problem in the exchange, or the budding exchange, because the British, as you'll recall, Churchill had said, we can't talk about Enigma and how we are breaking it, the German Enigma. That's the machine there that's on display at the, one of them that's on display at the museum. And so there's this imbalance in the exchange. And you know, they're ending up talking about Italian codes and codes used by British German patrol craft in the English Channel. And it looks like the discussion is not really going to go anywhere. But then there's the head of the British Army, or the senior British Army officer at Bletchley Park, a man named John Tiltman, shown there on the left. He realizes that we have a real problem, or the British have a real problem, given this inequity, imbalance in the exchange. And he goes to his boss, Alastair Denniston, who's shown there on the right, and says, this is all going to fall apart, these discussions with the Americans, if we don't reveal what we've done on Enigma. And Denniston's a little bit skeptical, but he said, okay, I will take this up the chain. He goes through Stuart Menzies, who is the head of MI6, Bletchley Park's security organization at the time, and ultimately they go into Churchill. And I'm very grateful to Tony Comer, the former historian at Bletchley Park, at GCHQ, for sending me the memorandum that Churchill initials. This is from Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, saying, we would like to enter into discussions on Enigma with the Americans. Will you reverse your ban? And Churchill says yes. And so that opens things up for the British. They tell the American delegation, we have broken Enigma, which the Americans thought was unbreakable. They demonstrate the bomb machines. There's one built by the Navy in the museum that you can see, or you can see images of it online. They demonstrate how they're breaking it. And it really creates an opportunity for a real discussion between the two sides. And so the reports of the Americans when they get back to Washington are glowing. Basically, this will save them a tremendous amount of effort in terms of working on German codes. You know, the contribution is invaluable and so forth. And so the rest of 1941, the visit was in early 1941. The rest of the year is spent with some kind of back and forth long distance discussions about successful cryptanalytic techniques and so forth. Now, obviously, there's a highly significant event at the end of 1941. That is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at the top. And that brings America into the war. And the United States begins a crash buildup of its capabilities that in some ways reminds me what we're going through now in terms of medical capabilities. But one of the things that they do, that Washington does, is begin to rapidly expand the Army and Navy code-breaking efforts. The Army, which is mainly what we're going to talk about from here on out, the Army code-breaking effort, it takes over a women's college in Arlington, Virginia, Arlington Hall. That's the last issue of the school newspaper there on the bottom left, announcing that the school was being closed because the Army was taking over. It becomes the headquarters of the Signal Intelligence Service, later renamed the Signal Security Agency for the Army. But a really significant development happens later in the year, and that is in 1942, and that is we start to see American ground forces in combat with the Germans and to a lesser extent the Italians in North Africa after the Allied landings there. And as a result of the buildup of its code-breaking capabilities, the Army is also on the cusp of delivering its own code-breaking machines. And so basically, we're developing another imbalance in the relationship, because the British were very, very reluctant to let anything having to do with Enigma leave the British Isles. They felt we have to, for security reasons, we have to keep it at Bletchley, and also that that it needs to be the product resulting, the intelligence resulting from the decryption of the Enigma needed to be very tightly controlled. So the Americans, essentially, to shorthand it, they want to set up their own Enigma code-breaking effort at Arlington Hall in Virginia, the Army does. And so this creates a significant dispute with Bletchley Park, because the British very much, as I just said, very much want to keep the Enigma capability, the traffic, the ability to break it centralized at Bletchley. And actually are begin to suggest, why don't you Americans focus on the Japanese? Because we really don't have the wherewithal to take on both targets at the scope and scale that we would need to be successful. So we want to stay focused on the Germans. But the Americans are very persistent. And this ends up with a new delegation going to Bletchley Park. So now we're in mid-1943, in the late spring and early summer. And the three men who go over are, I'll start on the right. That's William Friedman again, who was the most senior cryptanalyst in Army signals intelligence at the time, as well as on the left, Alfred McCormick, who actually was an attorney who had been recruited into the Army intelligence to help lead an organization that basically was tasked with taking signals intelligence and integrating it in with other sources of information into more finished intelligence product. And then a second lawyer who goes over with Friedman and McCormick is Telford Taylor, another Army officer, a major at the time. He's shown there in his general's uniform, because after the war, he becomes one of the prosecutors and ultimately the lead prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, which you may be familiar with his name from there. And so they go over in the summer of 1930, and they are astonished at what they see at Bletchley. Bletchley Park, of course, has been at this much longer than the Americans have at this point. They also had more of a signals intelligence capability and organization, a larger one and a more successful one before the war that they were able to build on. And what the three Americans who go over, McCormick, Friedman, and Taylor, see stuns them as to how good the British are, not just at breaking Enigma, but at taking the intelligence they get from that, wringing every shred of possible of information out of it, and integrating it with other sources to produce, comprehensive pictures of what is going on the battlefield throughout Europe. And essentially, the Americans realized it would be a huge mistake to try to replicate Bletchley Park in the States. We have to get people over here so that we can learn what the British are doing in terms of code breaking and intelligence production. Take that knowledge back to the States and apply it to Japanese. So essentially, they agree to the division of effort, with the caveat being that there's going to be a large American presence of ultimately, several hundred Americans served there during the war. And again, I'm talking mainly about the Army. The Navy has a separate arrangement going. And also the Americans agree to, we will use British security procedures and train our officers how to handle Enigma when it's going to commanders in the field. Now, I don't know how well this is going to show up, but this is actually a cartoon that I think is available in several different places. I found it down among Friedman's papers at a library in Virginia. And it kind of was an attempt by someone to capture the different types of people that the British had working at Bletchley Park. And it was a bit of, and Friedman was a bit fastidious, and he kept a diary and he describes a lot of this. And so, because he was a clean freak to some extent, he was somewhat appalled by the working conditions and, the fact that because of the war, things weren't really being able to keep up. It kept up well, except for the mission, obviously. And so, but he at the same time begins to wonder, I wonder if for all our fancy offices back in the States, the British aren't better code breakers. And it's not so much that they're better code breakers, but they're better at getting every scrap of information they can and bringing it to bear. So these are three of the Americans who go over. I'll mention them briefly. Art Levinson and Oliver Kirby, who are on the left and right, who are both in the Hall of Honor. And then William Bundy, a name he's the leader of the Army code breaking condition. It also includes some linguists and a few other personnel. But basically, Bundy's name you may recognize because he later becomes a senior official in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations during the Vietnam War at both the State Department and the Defense Department. And he's also a CIA official as well. He later becomes editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. Anyways, the group goes over, the initial group, I guess, was maybe about 40 people, or 40 officers and enlisted men from the Army in the second half of 1943. And an Army officer who is receiving them, he sees their profiles and he sees their scores they've gotten on Army aptitude tests. Bundy's was particularly high. He's supposed to have explained, this officer did, my God, I've never seen scores like this before. You guys are smart enough to be in intelligence, which was true. That was why they were there. So the American contingent works at Bletchley side by side with the British in the famous huts where the code breaking and intelligence production took place. They're really fully integrated into the operation. Bundy, I think, was one of the shift chiefs in Hut 6. They're again treated very well. And each of them recognizes that they are really the junior partners in this deal, and that the British have a great deal to teach them that they can bring back to the States. Now, as the war is winding down, we're going to shift a little bit to the end of World War II and the transition to the post-war world. there's a group called, or an organization called the Target Intelligence Committee is formed, or TICOM. And it basically, I like to think about them, if you've seen the movie The Monuments Men, as the electronic monuments men, because what they do is they go into formerly occupied Western Europe in the wake of the advancing British and American armies. And their job basically is to, scoop up every piece of communications and cryptologic equipment and material they can to interrogate, captured German code clerks and whatnot. The picture there on the left is a salvage operation on a lake in Germany that one of the TICOM team mounts because they've learned that the Germans have thrown a bunch of cryptologic material into the lake to try to get rid of it, and the Americans are recovering it. And so during this time also, the leaders of the three major allied nations, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, are meeting in Potsdam and elsewhere to come up with the post-war settlement and post-war arrangements for Europe in particular. And tensions are beginning to arise between the British, the Americans on the one hand, and the Soviets on the other. And one of the purposes of TICOM is to see what the Germans were able to do against the Soviets in terms of code breaking. Basically, William Friedman looks at a lot of the TICOM recovered material and documents in the summer of 1945 and realizes that actually the Americans and British had been very good at protecting their own communications from the Germans. The Germans were unsuccessful in attacking them. And they also learned that the Germans knew actually a great deal about Soviet cryptography and were able to break some systems. And so this gives perhaps the Americans, the British, a little bit of a leg up in the cryptologic battle with the Soviets that's starting to emerge after the war. So just a few things to wrap up. The experience of the Americans and the British during the war makes establishing a permanent agreement for the post-war period in terms of cryptology very easy between the successors to Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall for the Army and Nebraska Avenue for the Navy. And reading through some of the documents, there's just so much less contention and so much compared to earlier during the war that it does seem like it was just a very natural transition into a permanent post-war relationship that has endured to this day. There were also enduring personal relationships, and I think these are some of the most important. These were some of the most important factors, both during the war and after the war. And there's Alastair Denniston there shown in the middle. He and Friedman remained very close friends, as did Friedman and John Tiltman. Friedman wrote a very touching letter to Denniston's daughter after he died in 1961 that basically illustrated just how strong the bonds were and the personal feelings were between the men who had worked together at Bletchley Park and elsewhere during the conflict. And then finally, I just wanted to come back to William Bundy, the leader of the American code-breaking contingent that I mentioned earlier. He made a very interesting observation after the breaking of Enigma was disclosed in the 1970s. And he said, I was involved in managing the Vietnam War. And it was clear to me that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong just knew so much more about what we were doing than about what we knew about what they were doing. And having your government know what it needs to know is a tremendous asset for peace as well as war. And I think that is awfully important, he said, in contrast to his experience during World War II, which his widow told me several years ago. He, like Robert Weeks, thought his work at Bletchley was the most important work he had ever done during his career. And this is coming from a man who was involved in the management, for example, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that concludes my talk. I'd be happy to answer as many questions as I can in the time remaining, and I'll turn it back to Laura.
So we do have one question that came in, and it says, fascinating to hear about the Friedman connection. Has Tony Comer's replacement taken over? And is there an ability to have GCHQ and Bletchley further explore available historical information on the other side of the pond?
Yes, so Tony Comer, who was mentioned, was until last year the historian at GCHQ. And he retired last year, and a well-deserved retirement, I may add, because, you know, few people have done more than Tony has done to increase public awareness of the importance of cryptology and the importance of its history. And so there is a new historian in place at GCHQ, who I know is going to continue Tony's great work. And you know, the fascinating thing to me when I started working on this topic was had just been so much written about it that in some ways I wondered if I was really going to be able to come up with any new insights. And it turned out there was still a tremendous amount of information that really had not been explored, particularly about the people who worked at Bletchley, and also, you know, in code breaking in the United States. And so there's always more to do. You know, there's always more to find. There's always new information to come up with, and it always gets reinterpreted. And I'm confident that that will continue in the future.
Okay, we actually have some more questions for you, Dave. Also, did you mentioned Prescott Winter was part of the initial delegation. Was that the father of Press Winter, who later led innovations at the agency?
Yes.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So you know, I suspect that at NSA today, and for all I know at GCHQ and elsewhere, you know, there are now multi-generational families, you know, who have worked in cryptology. And for all I know, someday soon, you know, a fourth generation person is going to walk through the doors at one of these places. Maybe they already have, you know, maybe they already have. But I think, you know, there are some families where it appears that it just gets in the blood, you know, and it is something that children go into their parents' line of work.
Well, I'll just add that there's 3 generations in my family: my father, me, and then my daughter's a naval officer working at NSA Hawaii. So I guess that's true, right? Okay, another question was, what was the mechanism for moving Enigma derived intelligence from Britain to the US?
So in addition to the American codebreakers who go to Bletchley Park, there's another contingent that Taylor is one of the leaders of American military Army personnel, and there's Navy personnel as well, who are over there and who basically are responsible for selecting out material that they want to get to American commanders in Europe. And so these are, you know, the special security officers, or SSOs, and they basically there are some at Bletchley, and there are some attached to Army, Navy, Air Force units in the European theater of operations during the war. And it gets transmitted by systems like SIGABA, you know, the Secure American Army encryption device. And then the receiving SSOs at the front basically have procedures that they're using that were developed by the British and the Americans are following, to get as to how they can pass that information to American commanders, and whether they have to do what is called a sanitization in the process, in case they need to somehow conceal the source of the information.
Okay, well, thank you. And just one more note back to Tony Comer. I was just reminded that he is watching the presentation today, so he's out there in the webinar.
Yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of experts out there. I approached this session with some trepidation. I'm sure I'm going to get, emails afterwards saying, "Dave, you messed that part up," and that's okay. That's a part of the experience, and I'm glad when that happens.
There was another question from Alan. Will you later mention the Navy work? What about the U.S. Navy and their representative arriving in the summer of 1942?
Yeah, so I'm going to admit right up front that I am not nearly as familiar with the Navy operations as I am with the Army operations. The Navy was in many ways just as close to the British and to Bletchley as the Army was. They did things a little bit differently, and I'm going to confess right up front that I have not explored that sufficiently to give a really intelligent answer. But I'm sure that a lot of the procedures were very similar. They were just done in slightly different channels. And I think more work may have been done also back here, because the Navy built bomb decryption machines were highly successful at breaking Enigma.
Okay. Next, are there any remaining classification restrictions on either side of the US-UK relationship during World War II? In other words, is there any more historical material about this period that is still classified, and if declassified, could add to the insightful picture you've painted?
So my understanding, and so in full disclosure, my last job at the agency involved, among many other things, oversight of our declassification processes and our record management processes. I believe that virtually all of the material from World War II that we know about, that is in the National Archives possession or in our possession, has been declassified in some form. Now, I'm going to make a couple of exceptions, and I really don't know how much the scope of this involves. So there are some documents that were released back in the 90s that were released in redacted form that have not yet been re-reviewed. So you can encounter redactions in some material that probably at some point, the agency needs to go back and look at them again and see if, the rest of the information cannot be released at this point. I suspect there is also some information regarding the actual code breaking of specific systems that may still be classified, simply because the techniques involved are still valuable in some way or another. But I think that's a very small part of the total, and how much it would actually change the historical narrative, I think, is somewhat debatable.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. We're ready. Could you say something about the exchange of information on JN 25?
That's on the Navy side. And again, it's not something that I'm quite as familiar with, but I'll answer that in terms of Japan more generally. So the United States comes to have a much, much larger effort on the Japanese than the British do. The interesting thing is the British, particularly before and during the war, actually did a substantial amount of cryptanalytic work on Japanese systems. And you can encounter indications or suggestions where the initial British work becomes the basis for subsequent American work. And I suspect JN-25 is somewhat like that. Well, I know were exchanges taking place in the Pacific before Pearl Harbor, I think, on JN-25 between British and American codebreakers in theater. But I suspect that the same is true of JN-25, that ultimately the Americans are doing the bulk of the work. What I don't know is how much of that is based, a considerable amount obviously was based on the Americans' own work, but how much was also derived from some British successes early.
Okay, this is another Navy question. What was the Navy-operated Decrypt facility at Dayton, and where did the inputs on which it worked come from?
Yeah. This is people are getting back at me for not giving the Navy equal time, and I deserve that, I suppose. I deserve that. The Dayton was the site where the National Cash Register Company built the bomb description machines, the American bomb decryption machines, on basically using and enhancing Bletchley's design, as I understand it. There's some really valuable information about all this that is on a website that I hope is still in existence, called the Dayton Codebreakers. And I would refer people to that. And also, just look to seeing what you can find out about a man named Joseph Desch, who was, I think, if I recall correctly, the lead designer, or one of the lead designers out at National Cash Register for the Navy in developing the American bomb.
Yes.
My understanding is that it was basically built based on the designs that the British shared.
Okay. Now there's another question. Are there lessons from this era that can be applied to our partnerships today to help solve our cryptologic challenges?
So that's an excellent question. And I think the answer is unquestionably. The interesting thing, kind of straight off the bat, was how the leadership in the two countries each had their own reservations to some extent about this, whether it was military leadership or civilian leadership. But when the actual technical personnel get together, that's when the magic happened, or seemed to happen. People who knew specifically what it takes to do successful cryptanalysis and cryptology, and what is necessary for it to be successful. That's when really the value of the exchange begins. So that is, I think, one big lesson. But another big lesson, and I think we've seen this in public discussion, over the past several years, is just how valuable partnerships are. Because there are many instances during the, as part of the narrative that I've laid out today, there are many instances where one side or the other had a little piece that fit with what the other side was doing, and when you put them together, or they maybe just had one really smart individual gifted individual who when looking at information from the other side was able to make sense of it. And so I think the lesson is that always being mindful of security and the need to protect secrets and information and so forth, that the exchanges that these people have can be extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily important in defending the national security of democracies like ourselves and like that in Great Britain.
Okay. Another question. Were there cover stories to explain the origins for Enigma intelligence when it was disseminated? And if so, what were they? It's a great question.
Yeah. So, I do, there are some classic examples from the Battle of the Atlantic where basically, the British, or the Americans for that matter, would know from the breaking of Enigma that German U-boats were in a particular area, getting ready to attack. And the U-boats would have to surface every once in a while. And so the British and the Americans would make sure that they sent out, a spotter plane that the Germans would hopefully see, so that the Germans would think that it was through aerial reconnaissance that they had been discovered, rather than through code breaking, rather than through the breaking of Enigma. And there are any number of stories and ruses that were used by the Allies in that regard throughout the war, both in Europe and in the Pacific.
Okay, excellent. And so next is, where is the 1941 U.S. Navy report by Robert Weeks and Prescott Currier of their Bletchley Park visit?
Good question. Answer is, I don't know.
Oh.
So again, I have looked extensively in the Army records, which are in some ways easier to access and use and are better organized. I don't know. I know that Prescott Currier did some oral history interviews and actually wrote some articles after, that it was disclosed in the 70s that Enigma had been broken, that give a very good picture of his experiences at Bletchley Park. And Weeks did a few phone interviews with people like David Kahn that I've also read through. I'm sure there are Navy reports. I just have not found them yet.
Okay. And the next is, it's not really a question, but I think it was maybe when the one question was asked about Prescott Winter versus Prescott Currier. I think the answer was about Prescott Currier, right?
Yes, sorry.
It's okay. Okay.
I got confused. Yeah.
Well, no, you didn't get, it was the way the question was asked. So
Winter
I just want to make sure.
was named after Prescott Currier.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's all right. We're good. I just wanted to make sure so that everybody knew the answer. And then the next question is, what did each side expect from the 1941 mission? Were there specific crypto systems that they hoped the other side would help with? Was the purple a gift, a complete surprise?
This is another really good question. So the purple gift apparently was a complete surprise. I have found no indication that the Americans tipped off the British that, hey, we're coming over with this machine that we've built to decrypt purple. And so as far as expectations going in, this is very interesting because the four Americans who went, Sinkoff, Weeks, Currier, and Weeks, Sinkoff, Rosen, Currier, and Weeks, they all say we were given only the vaguest of instructions. We were basically told, go over, have a look around, and report back. And aside from taking purple and demonstrating it, because I don't think either side knew much about what actually the other was capable of. And so, that's part of the story here, is that it was a bit of a leap of faith on the part of the two sides, who really did not know that much about what each other was doing.
Okay. Another question. I know we focused on Japanese intelligence post Pearl Harbor and the British focused on German intelligence. What about Italian intelligence? I presume the Brits retained primary focus on them after the USA joined?
Yes, that is my understanding. Yeah. I mean, there was an Italian effort both before Pearl Harbor in Army intelligence, and there was an effort after Pearl Harbor, but I think they were fairly small compared to what the British did. And of course, that's the wrong way to put it, but Italian cryptography was relatively less complex than German, is my understanding.
Okay. And then How important was John Zimmerman in the building the foundation for the U.S.-UK special relationship?
So I believe very important. I think aside from his role during World War II, incidentally, I'll come back to this in a second. Aside from his role in World War II, he's very important in particularly the 1950s, and ultimately, relocates to the States, I believe, for an extended period of time, and is in the Hall of Honor of the National Security Agency. The interesting sidelight about Tiltman, so he comes over in 1942, I believe, comes to Washington for continuing discussions, and he's unable to get a hotel room because Washington apparently is so crowded. And so Friedman, who by this point knew Tiltman, said, "Why don't you come stay at our house?" And Tiltman does. This gets Friedman into huge hot water with the Army brass because, essentially he's hosting a foreign national in his home. And this almost stops Friedman from making that 1943 trip of his own to Bletchley Park, which was so important in establishing the American presence there, because, he's chastised by the Army brass, and it's only after, a considerable bowing and scraping and a mea culpa on Friedman's part that he's allowed to go.
Okay, and the last final question is, again, I think you answered this already, it was about the techniques to cover the operational attacks based on Enigma code breaking to cover their tactics and procedures.
Yep.
Anything else? Okay, I think that was all of the questions that we have. And then there was just one other comment that came in. There is a Dayton Codebreakers website, and it's daytoncodebreakers.org. Based on one of the other earlier questions. I think that is all we have. So for Dave, just to let you know, we do have a gift for you that we will get to you at some other point when we're all together. And so we will be presenting that to you at a later time. And now I guess we're ready to close the session. So you're getting a lot of on the comments, thanks, Dr. Dave. So just everybody's very appreciative of your talk today.
You're very welcome, Nicole.
Anybody this is Dave's book that's available from the NSA website at nsa.gov. And so we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. The program has been recorded and will be available on our website in the days to come. And if you liked our program today, please join us and become a member. As I mentioned at the beginning of our program, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization and depend on the support of our members and donors to provide our education programs like this one today. We're currently raising capital funds in a capital campaign to construct the Cyber Center for Education and Innovation that will become the new home for the National Cryptologic Museum. Again, our website, www.cryptologicfoundation.org. And to learn more, and please consider making a donation for this important project and allow us to continue education program like today's. So with that, we will close. Thank you all very much.